Thanks very much, Karen, and thanks everyone for coming out this evening. I'm glad that Karen referenced this brochure because it was in 2006 that Bob Newton invited me to become involved in the Church of the 21st Century work as they were just beginning to focus on the Catholic intellectual tradition as one of their areas of interest. And I was part of a committee that was trying to think about how do we help people better understand what we mean by the Catholic intellectual tradition. And that committee led to this booklet, which came out in 2010. In different ways, I think that work has informed a lot of what I've done as a scholar and as dean over the last number of years. So it's good to have the opportunity to share some of that with you. What I'm going to say tonight, in some ways, draws on and builds on and expands what's in the brochure, so there'll be some overlap there. But there are some new things as well. And I hope that you will allow me to draw on the wisdom of lots of other people as I speak with you tonight. In many ways, what I have to say is very much formed by the wisdom of three figures in particular: Michael Buckley, Michael Himes, and John Hoy. I think what they have contributed to our understanding of the Catholic intellectual tradition has been tremendously formative for me. So with that, we get started. My remarks this evening are prompted by a question that was recently posed by Cardinal Supich, the Archbishop of Chicago. What does it mean to be a Jesuit Catholic university at this time in history? This question was explored by Cardinal Supich in an encouraging, thought-provoking, and challenging essay that was published in American Magazine this past September. He began the essay by noting that this larger question, what does it mean to be a Jesuit Catholic university at this time in history, implies 5 more specific questions. I'm only going to talk about the first one, but it's useful to know, I think, what the other 5 are. How do these universities engage with the Catholic intellectual tradition? How do they integrate a truly Catholic imagination in their ministry of education? How do they incorporate the social teachings of the Church into their identity? How do the spiritual and corporal works of mercy help define their students? And finally, how does a Jesuit Catholic university invite students to understand our moral teachings at this moment in history? After articulating those questions, Cardinal Supich then poses this challenge. To the extent that educators can answer these questions and communicate those answers to their constituents, Jesuit Catholic universities will be able to more precisely define their identity in our present moment. Can we answer those questions and can we communicate them? I'd like to suggest an initial response to the challenge Cardinal Supich poses by considering the first of the more specific questions that he raises. How does a Jesuit Catholic university engage with the Catholic intellectual tradition? Cardinal Supich introduced the Catholic intellectual tradition in his essay in this way. The Catholic University matures in its understanding of the pilgrimage to the transcendent goal that gives meaning to life by relying on and adding to the living Catholic intellectual tradition. This vast repository of theological and philosophical thought includes the treasury of the devotional practices, the works of literature, the visual art, music, and drama, the styles of architecture, legal reasoning, the social and political theorizing, the pastoral practice, and the other forms of cultural expression that have emerged over the course of 2,000 years of Christian engagement in a dialogue between faith and culture. The premise of this dialogue is that the universe can be fully intelligible only in reference to God as its ultimate origin and end. As such, the search for truth in all aspects of life extends to the ultimate search for truth that animates faith. It's worth pausing for a moment over the way in which Cardinal Supich describes the Catholic intellectual tradition. He says the tradition is a vast repository of thought, practices, and forms of cultural expression. But Cardinal Supich also suggests that this vast repository of intellectual and cultural production is not just a bunch of static stuff to somehow be appropriated and applied to our contemporary context. Instead, the tradition is alive and on the move. The life of the university, he says, is part of a pilgrimage of the human family to the transcendent goal that gives meaning to life. The university matures in its understanding of this pilgrimage by both relying on and adding to the living Catholic intellectual tradition. And the tradition is grounded in a dialogue between faith and culture, a dialogue in search of truth in all aspects of life. Now, I'd like to suggest that focusing on the Catholic intellectual tradition primarily as a repository of truths and practices may not be the most fruitful way to enhance engagement with the tradition in the life of the Jesuit Catholic University at this time in history. It is certainly that, but that sort of starting point risks making engagement with the tradition something extrinsic to the experience of scholarship, teaching, and learning that is central to the lives of our faculty members and students as participants in the university community. The tradition, as vast repository of truth perspective, can seem to suggest that engaging in the life of the Catholic intellectual tradition is something that needs to be added on to a faculty member's expertise from the outside, requiring a prior mastery of some set of texts and teachings and practices that fewer of our faculty colleagues today might already possess than was the case in the past. Instead, our efforts to engage the Catholic intellectual tradition might be more fruitful if we put greater focus on the tradition as a distinctive sort of intellectual conversation. The Catholic intellectual tradition might most fundamentally be understood as a living and dynamic intellectual conversation across time, possessing a distinctive way of perceiving, exhibiting distinctive qualities of inquiry, a conversation that is grounded in and animated by a Catholic worldview. This foundational Catholic worldview affirms God as the source of all things, including all truth, is committed to the principles of sacramentality and incarnation, and aspires to authentic Catholicity, understood as a movement toward wholeness. Grounded in this worldview, the Catholic intellectual tradition can be understood as an integrative or Catholic approach to the search for truth that is characterized by several distinctive qualities of inquiry. First, and most fundamentally, a conviction that faith and reason are mutually illuminating, that they are united in the search for truth, and that people of truth must devote themselves to building a world characterized by an uncompromising commitment to truth, a world in which truth is explored and reverenced in whatever way it discloses itself, as Michael Buckley has written. In the words of the theologian Frederick Bauerschmidt, the central conviction that underlies the life of the Catholic intellectual tradition is the belief that all truth is God's truth. Second, a sacramental vision of reality that gives every discipline the potential to reveal something of the sacred. In the Catholic worldview, grace, God's life shared in loving self-gift, underlies all of reality. Given this foundation, the search for truth in any discipline can be a sacred and sacramental activity. Third, a hopeful commitment to the unity of truth, to intellectual integration among disciplines, combined with an appreciation for the integrity and autonomy of individual academic disciplines. This aspiration for Catholicity, for a wholeness that respects the integrity of the parts, for unity without uniformity, is ultimately grounded in the Catholic affirmation of the Incarnation, the union of the divine and human in Jesus Christ, and the unity of all things in God through Christ. And fourth, a reverence for the dignity of each human being as a person created in the image of God. This gives rise to a commitment to justice, to the solidarity of the human family, and to the common good. It seems to be that a shared conversation in the search for truth that is characterized by these qualities of inquiry is a search for truth that is enlivened by the Catholic intellectual tradition. No matter who the searcher is, and no matter what discipline is their field of inquiry. The Catholic intellectual tradition is at work Whenever questioning in any field is opening to moving beyond narrow disciplinary isolation and toward the horizon of human dignity, the common good, and the wholeness and fullness of life that the Christian tradition calls God's reign. I'm now going to say a bit about how Catholicity, sacramentality, and incarnation are entry points into the tradition. So first, Catholicity and the dynamism toward wholeness. Our understanding of the Jesuit Catholic University, animated by the Catholic intellectual tradition, needs first to be grounded in an adequate understanding of Catholicity. In the words of the Jesuit theologian John Courtney Murray, we need to have an orientation to the tradition that is not sectarian, but instead is, quote, Catholic in the adequate sense. The engaged presence of some number of Catholic faculty members with expertise in the Catholic tradition and the various academic disciplines is no doubt of critical importance. At the same time, however, fostering the intellectual and spiritual wholeness that is at the heart of the tradition need not be understood as something to which only those faculty colleagues who have immersed themselves in the vast repository of the Catholic tradition or become dual experts in theology and another discipline can contribute. John Hoy, who I mentioned earlier, in his book, Where is Knowing Going? The Horizons of the Knowing Subject, argued that a clear rationale for the distinctiveness of Catholic higher education might be found by seeking to better understand the notion of Catholicity and the connection between Catholicity properly understood and the Catholic intellectual tradition. The term Catholic has its roots in the Greek word katholikos, which Hoy suggests is better rendered in English as Catholicity. This Catholicity connotes movement toward wholeness. Accordingly, quote, sectarian Catholicity is a contradiction in terms. Hoy goes on to argue that Catholicity understood as an orientation toward wholeness is the characteristic dynamism that drives human knowing. Catholicity is the drive in us for a sense of the whole. In the face of a disconnected mass of information that lacks order or a sense of the whole, our desire to know pushes for a fuller whole, a more comprehensive view of reality. Inquiry, authentically animated by the Catholic intellectual tradition, builds toward a view of reality that is shaped by this Catholicity, by this dynamism in us for a sense of the whole. For Hoy, this understanding is what is fundamental about the tradition. This understanding of Catholicity makes membership in the Catholic intellectual tradition very large. Indeed, for Hoy, the Catholic intellectual tradition is, quote, formed by all those who have been prompted to seek an intelligible whole and have succeeded in doing so. The important role to be played by this dynamism of Catholicity was powerfully expressed by Pope Francis in his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si. He there explained that the specialization that is typical of our contemporary technological worldview makes it difficult to see the larger picture. And here's a lengthy quote from Pope Francis. The fragmentation of knowledge proves helpful for concrete applications, and yet it often leads to a loss of appreciation for the whole, for the relationship between things, and for the broader vision, which then becomes irrelevant. This very fact makes it hard to find adequate ways of solving the more complex problems of today's world, particularly those regarding the environment and the poor. These problems cannot be dealt with from a single perspective or from a single set of interests. A science which would offer solutions to the great issues would necessarily have to take into account the data generated by other fields of knowledge, including philosophy and social ethics. But this is a difficult habit to acquire today. It cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. The fragmentation of knowledge and the isolation of bits of information can actually become a form of ignorance unless they are integrated into a broader vision of reality. We urgently need a humanism capable of bringing together the different fields of knowledge in the service of a more integral and integrating vision. That strikes me as Pope Francis describing Catholicity. In a pair of essays published 20 years ago, Jesuit philosopher Gerald McCool similarly called attention to a dynamic, integrating vision at the heart of the Catholic intellectual tradition. For centuries, the tradition of Catholic education has sought to help students develop a distinctive, integrative habit of mind that McCool called a cultivated Catholic mind. Quote, a mind whose range was broad enough to embrace the realm of human knowledge as an articulated whole, yet sufficiently familiar with the diverse branches of knowledge to unify the multitude of disciplines without confusing them. That ideal of perspective, discipline of mind and imagination, analytic skill, and ability to see things as a whole was an integrated habit of mind. Movement toward this Jesuit ideal of an integrative whole in knowledge is therefore a central goal of a liberal education in a Jesuit university. McCool went on to explain that, quote, the Jesuit ideal of an integrative whole in knowledge as the goal of a liberal education, even if we take it as an asymptote, preserves education from a number of distortions. Faith in the presence in the world of a creating and redeeming God is a protection against a narrow, this-worldly secularism, or a despairing resignation to an unintelligible universe. Conviction that the human person has a divine call to wholeness is a defense against a narrow professionalism in education, or the tyranny of a single discipline. Interdisciplinary cooperation is neither a sacrilege nor an imposition, and fidelity to an old and coherent tradition frees the educator from slavery to the present or to the immediate future. So Catholicity, a call to wholeness, formation of an integrative mind as part of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Next, sacramentality and the religious density of all things. McCool also suggested that human knowledge integrated by a coherent education can, quote, lead a prayerful and reflective mind through the meaning which it finds in God's creation to knowledge and love of God himself. Inspired by that tradition in its 16th and 17th century form, my own intellectual ancestors, McCool's and mine, the old Jesuit schoolmasters, could cheerfully spend their life in the classroom. For what they were doing was forming minds which in the beautiful Ignatian formula could find God in all things. This conviction that God can be encountered in all things is grounded in a theology of creation and an openness to the sacramentality of all of creation. As our late Boston College colleague, Father Michael Himes, reminded us, all of creation, everything that exists, has its source in the self-giving love of God. In the words of Father Himes, the universe is rooted in grace. It exists because it is loved absolutely. Everything that exists is being held in being by God's love. Grounded in this claim about creation, Father Himes insists that, quote, to appreciate anything in its depth is to see it as revelatory of grace. In the Catholic tradition, this is known as the principle of sacramentality. As Father Himes explains, quote, anything, any person, place, thing, event, any sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, anything that exists can be sacramental if one views it in its rootedness in the grace of God. End quote. This principle of sacramentality provides an opening for every field of inquiry to be a venue for participating in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Father Himes insists that, quote, the entirety of Catholic liturgical life, indeed of Catholic spiritual, ethical, intellectual, and ethical life, is geared toward producing sacramental beholders. People who see what is there in its full depth, end quote. Because the task of any academic discipline, any field of inquiry, is to help people to see what is there in its full depth, Father Himes concludes that, quote, to teach any discipline or field is a holy activity. In his words, if we take the sacramental principle seriously, anything that awakens and widens and expands the imagination, opens the vision, and enriches the sensitivity of any human being is a religious act. For this reason, Father Himes insists that all teaching can produce sacramental beholders, even when the teachers do not know that this is what they are doing. If we truly see and truly appreciate the depth of what is really in front of us in our intellectual labors, Father Himes says we will be encountering grace. We will see the love that undergirds all that exists. So helping teachers and scholars and students to become sacramental beholders in this sense through their teaching and research and learning may be at the very heart of how a Jesuit Catholic university engages the Catholic intellectual tradition. Michael Buckley made a similar point by calling our attention to the ways in which the tradition of Ignatian spirituality affirms what he called the religious density of all things. A distinctive spirituality, a distinctively Ignatian understanding of God, underlies and animates Jesuit higher education. This understanding finds its most powerful expression in the concluding contemplation of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, the contemplation to attain love. At the heart of this exercise, Ignatius invites the retreatant to remember 4 fundamental points. This is how Buckley summarizes them. Everything that is a gift from God. Second, God dwells in all things. And this indwelling presence of God defines the nature of reality. Therefore, whatever is sacred. Third, God is laboring in all things to bring each one of us and all of creation to freedom and wholeness and fullness of life. Fourth, God is the source of all things. All that is comes from God. All that is participates in God's presence. This Ignatian vision of the religious density of all things gives life to the distinctive way of looking at the world that animates the life of the Jesuit university. Because God is laboring in all things, those attuned to Ignatian spirituality affirm that God is laboring in the scholarly life and work of the university. God is at work in the midst of our study and teaching and research in every discipline to which our questioning human minds apply themselves. Seeing the world in this way grounds the conviction that there can be a holiness, a sacramentality to all the things we do every day in our classrooms and offices, in our libraries and laboratories. We can encounter God in all these things. Because God dwells in all things and labors in all things, Jesuits and Jesuit universities are committed to the notion that, as the Jesuits gathered from around the world at General Congregation 35 in 2008 said, there is no reality that is only profane for those who know how to look. There's no reality that's only profane for those who know how to look. The Jesuits at GC 35 got that from Teilhard in the Divine Milieu. Next, incarnation. And Michael Himes' notion that whatever humanizes divinizes. Along with Catholicity and sacramentality, the Catholic intellectual tradition is also grounded in the fundamental Christian affirmation of the Incarnation. The heart of our faith is grounded in the conviction that in Jesus, God has joined God's divine life to our human life, so that all of us can share in the fullness of God's life. The Incarnation helps us to understand why the Church from its earliest days has been committed to a ministry of education and taken intellectual life seriously. Michael Himes explains it this way, quote, if the radical claim of the Incarnation is true, then you and I and God share humanity in common. And so to become like God, we become as fully human as we are. Thus, whatever enriches and deepens our humanity, whatever makes us braver, wiser, more intelligent, more responsible, freer, more loving, makes us holy. That is, makes us more like God. Thus, education, which certainly should aim at making human beings as fully human as they can be, is a work of sanctification. Education, taken in its richest sense as the formation of the human person in the full and harmonious exercise of all his or her capacities, is a religious act for those who believe that humanity is what they and God have in common. Education for full human living and the rigorous scholarly pursuit of the truth of what it is to be human have religious significance. Because as Father Heim says, whatever humanizes, divinizes. He goes on to say, whatever makes you more genuinely human, more authentically, richly, powerfully human, whatever calls into play all the reaches of your intellect, your freedom, your energy, your talents, and creativity, makes you more like God. If one accepts this understanding of the incarnation, Father Heim's notes, it becomes perfectly obvious why Christianity had to give rise to universities in the Middle Ages. This affirmation of the incarnation also gives life to what Michael Buckley calls the inherent unity between the religious and the academic at the heart of the Catholic intellectual tradition. The tradition's aspiration for this unity recognizes the legitimate autonomy of the academic disciplines, while at the same time challenging all the disciplines to remain open to the possibility of the unity of truth, a wholeness of truth that manifests Catholicity. For Buckley, Jesus Christ as the union of the divine and the human, in which each of the constituents remains itself, is the paradigm for this unity. Christ remains fully human, indeed more completely human, in his unity of humanity and divinity. Similarly, from the perspective of the Catholic intellectual tradition, Buckley says, quote, physics does not become theology and business is not piety. Law remains forever itself, and mathematics has its own autonomy. So autonomy and integrity, but a kind of unity. For Buckley, preserving the individual integrity of the disciplines, quote, allows for them to be united rather than identified. And this union, not identity or confusion, is finally between faith and all forms of human culture, end quote. To come back to my friend John Hoy, the individual integrity and legitimate autonomy of the disciplines characterizes the Catholic University, in his words, quote, as necessarily a secular operation. But the tradition's aspiration toward the wholeness and unity of truth in God keeps that secularity healthy. As with Catholicity and sacramentality, grounding what is distinctive about Catholic intellectual life in the incarnation invites all those involved in the life of the university to participate in and contribute to the life of the tradition. John Courtney Murray, for example, suggested that the incarnation grounds the conviction that, quote, he who entered the stream of history as its redeemer is the Logos, eternal reason. Through his spirit, he is still immanent in history, there to do a work of reason, that work of reason which is justice. Hence, all efforts by whomsoever put forth toward the rationalization of human society, its justification and pacification, are put forth in the line of action of the Logos himself. He is in mysterious alliance with them. This humanizing action is participative in the action of Christ as Logos. So, Catholicity, sacramentality, incarnation. How might we put some of this into operation? For a Jesuit Catholic university truly to be animated by engagement with the Catholic intellectual tradition, we need to find ways to sustain a university-wide intellectual culture in which faculty members come to experience the engagement with the Catholic tradition as something more than a call to draw on a vast repository of truths and practices. Instead, we need to help faculty members experience engagement with the tradition as something exciting and dynamic, something that flows out of what John Courtney Murray described as the excitement inherent in the free search of the mind for truth and order, giving rise to a project that responds to an inner need of the human spirit itself. For this to happen, I think we need to find ways to foster conversation with faculty colleagues that will allow them to connect the tradition's aspiration for wholeness with their own innate drive for Catholicity as it manifests itself in their intellectual lives. John Hoy suggests that this sort of engagement with the tradition might begin by inviting faculty to reflect on the questions and desires that drive their own particular scholarly work. We might ask our colleagues questions like these. Describe the good you are attempting to achieve through your teaching, research, and service. What is it that you find compelling or life-giving about your pursuit of this particular research question? Do you have a dream, a hope, or a long-term project that you are seeking to implement in and through your discipline? Do you see your work as being of a piece with a larger whole? Does your faith play a role in your work? And if so, how concretely is your faith connected to your work? This sort of questioning might open up a conversation that seeks to move beyond narrow disciplinary isolation to make connections leading to a deeper understanding of the human person and a more comprehensive realization of the common good. Such a conversation might be open to the inbreaking wholeness and fullness of life that the tradition calls the reign of God. We need, therefore, to try to engage faculty colleagues in conversations that invite reflection on the ways their search for meaning or coherence or truth in whatever their discipline might be, as Michael Buckley puts it, is inchoatively religious. The intellectual dynamism inherent in all inquiry initiates processes or habits of questioning that, if not inhibited, inevitably bear upon the ultimate questions that engage religion. Rather than understanding the Catholic intellectual tradition simply as a collection of texts or a body of teaching that scholars must master in order to participate fully in the life of the tradition, the tradition, as I've described it, is a dynamic conversation extended over time with a highly diverse range of participants. It's an ongoing tradition, an ongoing conversation made of varying strands, multiple voices, and a range of positions. In the words of Frederick Bauerschmidt, quote, "It would seem that the fostering of the Catholic intellectual tradition not only allows for, but even requires, truth to be sought wherever it might be found, in authors who hold the Christian faith, or another faith, or perhaps no faith at all. For the conversation that is the tradition to be a living and self-reflective conversation, it must be open both to the inclusion of disturbing voices and to conflict among the voices engaged in the conversation. The desire for truth that lies at the heart of the tradition demands that all assertions of truth, meaning, and purpose be tested by the best evidence against them. Evidence that may be presented by anyone of any or no religious tradition who is engaged in serious inquiry. The Catholic intellectual tradition manifests its Catholicity, its striving for wholeness, whenever all the participants in the life of the college or university see their research and study and work of student formation in the context of the largest possible questions that can be asked about the world in which we live. I think the Catholic intellectual tradition is alive when scholars articulate the good they are working toward in their scholarship and understand their research as contributing to the unity of knowledge. When intellectuals explore their deepest questions across disciplinary boundaries in an objective search for answers that lie outside their own specializations. When teachers nurture in their students a sense of wonder and a love of learning, both for its own sake and as preparation for a life of service. And when the university promotes a free, open-ended dialogue between faith and reason, carried on without fear. Now some concluding thoughts about a question. Throughout this presentation, I've suggested that the Catholic intellectual tradition itself is best understood as a conversation. It should be clear from my remarks that this conversational engagement with the Catholic intellectual tradition in the life of the Jesuit Catholic University is necessarily connected to a distinctively Catholic worldview, to a way of seeing, to this conviction that ultimately there is no reality that is only profane for those who know how to look. This religious density of all things, this Catholic sacramental understanding of all of creation, has a particular resonance for Jesuits and Jesuit universities because of the way in which this worldview is exemplified in the life of Ignatius, and the spiritual experience his life opens up for all of us. It's kind of a lengthy quote from C21 again that I think explains this in a way that I find important and moving. While at Manresa, Ignatius had an experience at the River Cardinere that opened his eyes so that all things seemed new to him, because he began to see them with new eyes. Reality became transparent to him, enabling him to see God working in the depths of everything and inviting him to help souls. This new view of reality led Ignatius to seek and find God in all things. To find divine life at the depths of reality is a mission of hope given to us Jesuits. We travel again the path taken by Ignatius. As in his experience, so too in ours, because a space of interiority is opened where God works in us. We are able to see the world as a place in which God is at work and in which is full of God's appeals and of God's presence. Our mode of proceeding is to trace the footprints of God everywhere, knowing that the Spirit of Christ is at work in all places and situations and in all activities and mediations that seek to make him more present in the world. Ignatius came to see things with new eyes. Ignatius came to see the world as a certain kind of place where God is at work. It's about seeing. This experience and this way of proceeding lead to the assertion that there is no reality that is only profane for those who know how to look. And here's the question or issue. But this assertion requires at least some participants in the life of the university to know how to look in this way. How widely shared in the life of the university is this view of reality, this way of seeing? General Congregation 35 recognized the imperative need for formation in this way of seeing. In the words of Decree 2, we must communicate this way of looking and provide a pedagogy inspired by the spiritual exercises that carries people, especially the young, into it. Thus, they will be able to see the world as St. Ignatius did. How can we help more people to see the world as St. Ignatius did? Or as Cardinal Sukic might ask, how can we help our colleagues in the university understand and communicate this way of looking at the world? Could we be doing more to provide a pedagogy that carries our students and colleagues and companions in the life of the university more effectively into this way of looking at the world? In his September essay, Cardinal Sukic posed this question: what is the role of the Catholic University in carrying on its work in the Catholic intellectual tradition by fostering a sense of prayer and the mystery of God, by providing experiences of the mystagogy of the sacraments and the liturgical life? Cardinal Stupic's reference to the sacraments and liturgical life invites us, I think, to return to Michael Heim's discussion of sacramentality as one of the key entry points for the Catholic intellectual tradition. Because God is always and everywhere loving and sustaining all that is, because grace undergirds all that exists, there's a sacramental potential in all disciplines. Everything is potentially sacred. Teaching and scholarship in any field is a holy activity that can produce sacramental beholders. But Brother Himes also notes that what is omnipresent is more often than not unnoticed. This helps explain why the Church identifies and celebrates 7 public sacramental rituals, even though anything can be a sacrament. If we are going to be formed as sacramental beholders, if we're going to learn the distinctive view of reality and way of seeing that animates the Catholic intellectual tradition, all of this somehow needs to be made explicit. Brother Himes explains it in this way: what is always and everywhere the case must be noticed, accepted, and celebrated somewhere, sometime. If grace is omnipresent, grace is likely to go unnoticed. We require occasions when grace is called to our attention, when it is made concrete for us, when that which is always the case is made present in such a way that we cannot help but notice it, and either accept it or reject it, and if we accept it, celebrate it. In the life of our universities today, who is doing this noticing, accepting, and celebrating of the omnipresence of grace? Who are the colleagues and leaders in our academic communities whose lives are immersed in this way of seeing and can articulate, explain, and share it with those around them? What institutional structures or occasions do we have that can facilitate the noticing, accepting, and celebrating that characterizes the lives of the sacrament beholders we hope to form, and whose pursuit of the truth contributes to the humanizing, divinizing, incarnational Catholicity of the Catholic intellectual tradition? We'll need to keep reflecting on these questions if engagement with the Catholic intellectual tradition is to give life to our Jesuit Catholic universities in the years that lie ahead. Thank you.